Welcome. My name is Tita Chico, and I am Professor of English and Faculty Director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland. The center convenes this year-long series on anti-racism to act on statements of solidarity for Black Lives Matter issued by the department, the college, and the university. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Walter Wallace, Black Lives Matter. With this series, we celebrate the memory of Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, a young Black man who was about to graduate from Bowie State University when, on May 20th, 2017, he was murdered by a white supremacist at a University of Maryland campus bus stop. Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, Black Lives Matter. Our event today, Why Black Lives Matter in the Humanities, comes from the title of an essay of one of our guests, Professor Felice Blake. We're very grateful to be co-sponsoring this event with the University of Maryland Honors Humanities Program. I'm very grateful to Professor Randy Ontiveros for joining in this collaboration. The Center's Anti-Racism Series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries, the Graduate School's Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and the Patru Foundation. With this support, we're able to commit to making these events accessible with live captioning. And you'll find the live captioning link in the Typewell window, which is in the chat and in your Eventbrite ticket. I want to thank Danielle Griffin and Liam Daly, the Center's graduate assistants, and I want to offer a very special thanks to Dr. Karen Nelson, co-director of the Center and Director of Research Initiatives for the department. Our speakers will be in conversation for a half hour, after which we'll open up for questions, and we'll invite you to post your questions in the Q&A. And for now, I want to turn it over to my colleague and very good friend, Professor Randy Ontiveros, Director of Honors Humanities. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a real joy to be with you here today. We are all on a lot of Zoom events. This is one that I've been looking forward to for a very long time. As Professor Chico said, my name is Randy Ontiveros. I teach and research and serve at the University of Maryland in the field of Latinx studies. I'm an associate professor of English, and I'm also the proud director of the Honors Humanities program, which is one of our campus's living learning programs. Many of the students in my freshman level Introduction to Arts and Humanities are here. Hello, students. And in the last couple of weeks, we have been studying together, along with our graduate assistant and PhD candidate in English, Justine de Camillis, K-pop and hip-hop as part of our music unit. With the help of Professor Blake's essay, How Does Cultural Criticism Work in the Age of Antiracist Incorporation, and also her essay, Why Black Lives Matter in the Humanities, which we're focusing on today, we've been using a Birmingham cultural studies framework to explore how these two genres, K-pop and hip-hop, are connected in often contradictory ways to what Professor Blake calls the complexity of Black expressivity, and also what these genres reveal about the joy and pain, alienation and collectivity of life under regimes of neoliberal capitalism around the globe. So with that as context, it's a special honor to introduce our two presenters. Professor Felice Blake is an associate professor of English at the University of California at Santa Barbara. She's published widely, including her 2018 book, Black Love, Black Hate, Intimate Antagonisms in African American Literature, and her co-edited 2019 volume, Anti-Racism, Inc., Why the Way We Talk About Racial Justice Matters. Professor Blake is joined in conversation today with Professor Alison Reed. Professor Reed is an assistant professor of English at Old Dominion University. Her writing, which explores performance, identity, power, and social movement, has appeared in numerous journals and edited collections. Professor Reed, if I understand it right, is a poet also. And she's completing a book project entitled Love and Abolition, The Social Life of Black Queer Performance. Please join me in giving a virtual welcome to Professor Blake and Professor Reed.
Thank you so much. That was a really beautiful introduction. And thank you everyone for being here today with us. I would be remiss if I didn't make a special thank you again to Professors Tita, Chico, Randy Ontiveros, Karen Nelson, as well as Liam Daly, the graduate student who's been helping to coordinate this, and really to everyone else who's helped to organize this really, really important series on anti-racism. I also have to say hi to Alison. It's really wonderful to see you again, like so many of us who haven't seen our loved ones, but have only seen them through the boxes that we're all a part of now on Zoom. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to be with Alison, who is certainly a collaborator, but also a good friend for this conversation today. It's a tough time. If you're out there, I think you all are aware of this. I want to just begin by saying that the articles that you all have been reading in preparation for this meeting, they actually came from meetings. These were not public gatherings, but they were meetings that had sort of three components that I hope will be a part of what people can take away from the conversation that we're about to have. So the Antiracism Inc. collection began here at UCSB, the Center for the Studies of American Cultures in Global Contexts. At that time, I was the director and wanted to really think about an issue that I'm sure so many of you have also been addressing, which is the way that the political right has really stolen the language of anti-racism and anti-discrimination to serve its own needs. And by that, I mean an agenda that actually reproduces and maintains the racial status quo, or the racial order, as others have called it. So we gathered together, really bringing our expertise, not prepared remarks or statements, but our expertise from our individual research work, activism, creative work, to try to think together how to make sense of the way we were seeing the incorporation of anti-racist discourses in our current moment. So from that sort of calling in of people, we really sought to educate, the second part, to educate ourselves and each other by talking together and thinking together about what we were seeing and the kind of impact that it was having, of course, on our world broadly and more globally, but also in terms of our local realities and situations. And together from that, we also added the third part, which is we might call direct action, right? So based on this collectivity that we were creating, what did we learn from each other, and how could we apply that in ways that could bring about a transformation, whether that be in consciousness, language, thinking, creativity, activism, that could really transform the world ultimately. It's sort of bittersweet, very fond to remember that time that we had together. But of course, right now, our meetings are really challenged by a number of issues, the pandemic certainly being one of them, but also the realities of policing and the violence that we're seeing the police create, right, throughout our society, of course in the US, but not only. Again, these are structures that are connected to the ways that policing functions happen throughout the world. We're also here meeting over Zoom, which again, as others have mentioned, there is a Zoom fatigue, but we've also been witness in this time to the kind of censorship that Zoom as a corporation, right, has also exhibited. And I'm thinking specifically about panels that happened at San Francisco State University and planned panels at NYU that have been canceled by Zoom. So again, the question of how to meet, how to gather, and to do this work together is also being constrained by, again, many of the same forces that are in conjunction with the critique of the incorporation of anti-racism that was an important focus of that project and of the collection that you all have looked at. Across many of our campuses, mine included, you know, we're also talking much more about diversity, equity, inclusion, and yet this is also occurring over Zoom, given the kinds of issues and concerns. We sort of stop and ask ourselves, right? As we think about abolition, about transformation, you know, to what degree do we imagine that we might become anti-racist after a session, right? After a Zoom meeting or after an event? And in what ways do we also want to think about the really complex ways and the long-term struggle that's involved in transforming how we think and understand our specific contexts, the processes of racialization, the function of racism, and how it operates in this specific moment. So I certainly come to this as a scholar of literature and culture, as a student, an ongoing and lifetime committed student of Black study. This means also a question of politics, cultural politics, and so on. I'm reminded of a really incredible book by the author William Maxwell. This book was titled FBI's Eyes, as in EYES, where he really is thinking as one of the main readers of African American literature in particular. And he describes in that book, again, if you think about something like the Norton Anthology of African American Literature, in his introduction, he describes the process of making FOIA requests to try to figure out to what degree the CIA was actually looking at various African American writers who we would hold dear and have canonized in these anthologies. And one of the things that's so striking there is that about 50%, right, of the authors for whom he had made FOIA requests all had files, right, by the FBI. So again, we're reminded of the kind of surveillance apparatus that was a part of, right, the reading of African American literature. And hopefully that alerts all of us to remember that the creative expression, that radical imaginary of these authors was really understood as a threat, right, to the nation itself. So we don't want to reconstitute a sort of casual relationship to the reading of this literature. Instead, we want to hold on to that awareness of the radical possibilities that were involved in what we might think of as a Black radical imaginary or Black radical imagination. That these were writers and authors and creators who were really trying to imagine the world anew, and in ways that were perceived as so threatening, right, to make the CIA and FBI one of the primary readers of these documents. So in this moment when, as many of us have seen on Twitter or other forms of social media, the degree to which, right, we're being recommended to read Baldwin, right, to engage Audre Lorde. But we also want to keep in mind that what these authors were offering us was the very possibility of a radical transformation that included the creative imaginary as a way of being able to transform our minds and the world that we live in. So when I thought about, again, why Black Lives Matter to the humanities, or why the study and engagement with literature is so important, I wanted to really question, again, what's been circulated as a sort of perceived irrelevance, right, of the humanities, where people are often concerned for reasons, legitimate, right? What kind of a job can I get, right? How much money can I earn with a degree in literature? But we also want to think about in the context of wage stagnation, right? Where the cost of living has become unbearable or unmanageable for so many of us. The pandemic reminds us of the absence of healthcare. And so many issues that we're confronting that, again, remind us of a shrinking welfare state and the kind of new investments in finance capitalism, as well as the prison industrial complex as a major industry, right, for the economy and for the circulation of monies. So again, when we say that we are critiquing the incorporation of anti-racism, what we're focused on is the way that that incorporation means a neutralization of those critical interventions that were being made even by the poets, right, essayists and novelists that we all hold so dear. And before I finish these opening remarks, I just want to remind us of, again, some of these writers. Again, if we think about someone like Zora Neale Hurston, who was an incredible novelist, an essayist, a cultural critic, an anthropologist, and yet critical of every single field that she actually engaged in. We remember that her energy was really about the transformation of society, and that is what guided her engagement with this complex imaginary that was emerging from Black life and lived experience. So with that, my hope is that we can think and talk today about the way that that radical imagination was deeply connected to the possibilities for transformation and consistently working in opposition to those forces that would either attempt to neutralize that vision of radical possibility or to sanitize, right, the kind of raw energy and power that they all recognized was a way that we begin to imagine new worlds.
Wonderful. So I just want to echo Felice's warm gratitude for the organizers, as well as to just see your face, Felice. We've been talking on the phone because we're tired of screens, but it is nice to see all your faces. So thank you. I'm so glad to be here. How does a poem stop a prison from being built? As this question suggests, I want to reflect with y'all today on the poetic work of Imagining Otherwise, which has animated the Anti-Racism Inc. project and collection. For example, we formed the Coalition for Sustainable Communities, which was in solidarity with activist groups such as Curb and Poder interviewed in the collection. Our name, the Coalition for Sustainable Communities, was chosen to make known what we stand for, not just what we stand against. The anti is a reactionary posture, only gets us so far. The Black radical imagination moves to the works, which is to say how we can model transformative approaches to justice, even and especially when they defy state recognition. The poetic imagination, we argue, is key to dismantling the burning house of global racial capitalism. As I always tell students, we can't just put out some fires here and there. We must build a new foundation. I also want to think with y'all about the links between the structural, cultural, and carceral. This is because abolition, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore would say, is about presence, not just absence. Abolition is about building a new world, not just about dismantling the prison industrial complex. Anti-Racism Inc. and Anti-Racism Works are a dialectic in thinking, meaning as we critique the popular incorporation of anti-racist discourses to perpetuate racism, we are also moving from critique to action. That said, we do need to be critical following Dr. Blake's remarks about the surveillance of literature, of the way anti-racism as well as abolition have gone taken up in a way to sanitize their radical potential. In the book, we trace how from the canon wars to today, diversity has been disciplined. Here I mean in two senses, both ideological and repressive. It's about disciplinary siphons, for example, the academic disciplines, but also about the carceral regime, for example, the school-to-prison pipeline. We've critiqued multiculturalism as a politics of inclusion and incorporation. As Felice has argued, disciplinary formations remain unchallenged in the incorporation of multicultural literatures into English departments. This mirrors the larger problem of replacing sustained conversations about racism with feel-good dialogues about race. We must therefore ask ourselves, what kinds of diversity management does the university desire? To say it another way, what anti-racist subjects does the university imagine itself producing? I almost said policing. Interesting. For example, my essay in the collection, Gentrifying Disciplines, posits that the theft of real political contestations, of safe space, trigger warnings, and free speech can be understood as a new canon war formation. We must follow Dr. Blake's call for race-conscious reading practices against these forms of refusal and disavowal embedded in the canon wars. I want to think about another canon, one I consider in my forthcoming book, Love and Abolition, The Social Life of Black Queer Performance, which traces the affective and social lives of arts activism and prison abolition as a daily practice. In the book, I define love as replacing systems of control, criminalization, and coercion with deep forms of communal care. Positing the real work of art and abolition, this book seeks to reconcile the existing divide between social scientific approaches to the prison industrial complex and creative ones. The Black radical tradition concretizes the need for new reading practices in the genre of prison literature, which was in part inaugurated and championed by liberal actors to incorporate and quell the dissent of prison uprisings in the 1970s. This mirrors the canon wars, where multicultural politics of inclusion and incorporation favored discussions of race absent commitments to addressing institutional racism. This book, therefore, offers a study of what I term abolition literature. The genre of prison literature is often taken up in a way that fetishizes and presumes the inevitability of cages. Abolition literature, in contrast, understands human caging as part of a dense network of racialized carceral violence. Second, abolition literature supplements the sociological bed of critical prison studies with the creative work, especially the everyday interventions of incarcerated activists and intellectuals. It includes not only what people stand against, but what they stand for. It includes both anti-prison writings that challenge the compulsory reliance on cops and cages, and work such as my performance archive that dream other worlds into existence. I've often considered from the location of an English department how the carceral state easily gets reduced to a matter of style, to an aesthetics that unwittingly normalizes its violences. Critical prison studies, as I've suggested, is grounded in the social sciences, but the study of prison literature as literature is often divorced from an excavation of the carceral state. In other words, it's trendy to be interested in the prison and its literary expressions, but not actually invested in dismantling it. Since the reification of the genre of prison literature as a field of study risks absenting this abolitionist praxis, abolition literature reasserts the fact that one cannot separate the politics from the poetics of art produced in carceral spaces. In closing, I want to briefly think about how, in 2020, despite the persistence of white tactics of co-opting the hashtag, including widely critiqued claims to All Lives Matter, and I recently saw someone wearing a shirt that said Drunk Wives Matter, as well as commercial sloganeering, some new trends arise as well. For example, in the wake of the sustained uprisings this summer amidst COVID, two significant shifts emerge. One, the movement for Black lives no longer meets the same kind of white liberal resistance vis-a-vis All Lives Matter, but has seen a large-scale appropriation by major corporations and universities as an empty slogan akin to diversity rhetoric or multicultural band-aid. And two, abolition has entered mainstream conversations, with abolitionists actively working to stay ahead of the discussion about what it actually means, such as Miriam Kaba's op-ed piece, "Yes, we mean literally abolish the police," Both the attempted incorporation of the language of Black Lives Matter and abolition come as no surprise, given that this defanging of the Black radical tradition is part of an ongoing attempt to neutralize revolutionary critique through co-optation. I'm going to ask a question by way of an anecdote. There's a church I pass by on my daily walks around the neighborhood. It displays a Black Lives Matter banner alongside high-tech security cameras and an ominous no trespassing sign. This violent juxtaposition points to how anti-racism is not seen as incompatible with carceral investments in racialized surveillance, policing, criminalization, and imprisonment as a sinister form of public housing. With this anecdote of the securitized church with BLM signs put up this summer, indicating this appropriation of BLM as an empty slogan, stripped of its historical reference and organizing context, how has the pandemic revealed that the recourse to anti-racism is already mired in incorporation? Moreover, and I think we'll get to this in the Q&A, but amidst this incorporation of Black Lives Matter and abolition, what possibilities arise for new social formations? I know Felice already touched on, socializing, studying, and organizing, or to recall Robin Kelly's Post-it note reminder, love, study, struggle.
So when I began, I mentioned this sort of calling in, right? A gathering. We want to meet and bring people together to really think about forming community. When I was in the abolition reading group that's happening here on our campus, and again, everyone is welcome. If you're interested, you can email me and I will send you the link. But, if I were to ask my friends, colleagues here, right, don't call the police, but would they feel comfortable if they were in struggle, had a crisis, to call me? So we always are thinking about, again, how do we form community? And then how do we educate ourselves, learn together, right? This commitment to struggle. And then after that, again, thinking about direct action. So the conversation that Alison and I are having is meant to model, right, these three sort of prongs. And I'm always indebted to Clyde Woods, again, the late professor from Black Studies here, who talked about the significance of what it means to form communities of consciousness. We're not born into a community of consciousness. These are things that we also struggle to create and develop through, again, calling each other in, learning together, and committing to struggle together. So the opportunity that we have, right, is to commit to study, not as a passive or solitary act, but study as active engagement, as a transformation of consciousness. So one of the things that I think about here, right, is, as people have said, right, think globally, act locally. On our campus and across the UCs, as well as some of the Cal States community colleges, and of course, other places across the nation, there's been an active move to argue for the dissociation of the police to campuses. This is, but again, Cops Off Campus, right, is the campaign. So part of that work has involved some of us here in Santa Barbara actually thinking about local policing, right? How does that function here on this campus in this county? Work at our local jail, really interviewing people who were housed there. Our focus was on whether or not their civil rights, what that's the way that incarceration and a respect of civil rights, these are terms that are right, contradictory to each other. And think about something like abolition, about policing, we might ask ourselves, what's happening in my local community, right? How are people already moving and organized where I live? What do I have to offer, right, to these existing organizations and networks? And along with that, what do I have to learn in order to involve myself and to be a productive contributor? And then finally, how can I be of service? We all have skill sets, knowledge, expertise. Again, as a scholar of literature, we think about the question of literacy, not just the ability to read, but understanding in this country the long history between literacy and the production of racism, right? That the denial of literacy was certainly about the denial of access to education, but it was also the denial of reason, right? Of logic, of intelligence to certain groups. So the very question of literacy as a scholar of literature is a political question as well. So all of these things become ways that we can start to think about how we use what we have and to make that ready for service and for participation in the production of these communities of consciousness that we need to bring about the kinds of transformations that we're interested in. As usual, we have so many more things that we'd like to say than perhaps time allows. So let me stop there and ask Alison if she also would like to make some final comment.
I'll just add that we do have so much more we want to say, but thinking about local context, I remember at the abolition panel we had in Seattle, Felice, how we were talking about the question of scale. And I'm also thinking about Adrienne Marie Brown's work on, emergent strategy and sort of fractal capacities of social movements, that we have to think about these sort of intimacies in social movements. And if we only think about, movements in the abstract in the sort of broad scale, it can seem overwhelming. It can be affectively overwhelming. But when people look to what folks are doing in their communities every day to organize, to study, to plot and plan and dream together, it opens a portal for, really being invested in the work. And, we understand that the work does not just happen, although the university is one site of struggle, right? So thinking about cops off campus, but it's not the only one. And so, Black studies, of course, emerged out of and in solidarity with broader organizing contexts. And so, as we study, we always have to keep in mind that our work is indebted to much broader legacies, and it also can find homes in much smaller contexts than the kind of large-scale critical frameworks we often think about in terms of a critique of power.
Okay, I think at this point we'll invite the attendees to start posting questions, and Brandy and I will kind of go back and forth to get things started. And I want to know, of course, I want to hear all the other things that are on the notepads and the things that you've been talking about, or anticipating discussing. And one of the things that I want to kind of use to begin our thinking is the very powerful ways that anti-racism becomes, it's in the title of your book, of incorporated, and it becomes neutralized. And I'm very mindful that this is a series that promotes itself as anti-racism, research, teaching, and public engagement. And that was a response to the impoverishment of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Those are words and terms that have been around in committees, and look where we are. It's same old in a certain kind of way. And I'm also very struck in the powerful accuracy of the thick description of Black Lives Matter as a, I think your use of the term incorporated is brilliant. It's folded into, and it is part of the corporate lexicon, and the university is not exempt from that at all. And so, can you talk a little bit I mean, the university, and it gets a little bit to where you were concluding, Alison, the university as one site of struggle. The University of Maryland, where we're situated, is not anomalous in its incoherence. On the one hand, the Women's Studies Department was just renamed to honor Harriet Tubman, right? And that is a kind of about the monument, kind of Harriet Tubman is a monument, right? On the other hand, this is a campus where hate crimes take place, where the admission statistics of Black and African students is plummeting. Why would they come here? So that kind of, if you could just talk a little bit more about kind of the university as a space, as a place for the kind of where the radical inroads are.
So I just want to say a couple of things, and then of course Alison will share as well. I was speaking with one of the other editors on the collection. This is Dr. Paula Ioanide. She was describing her participation in one of these diversity, equity, inclusion events. Again, it wasn't on campus. This was with a private corporation. And when she used the term equity, most people in the audience believe that she was referring to the sort of stock value, right? Value in their individual homes, right? It was connected to private property. So there's a way when we say equity, right? We imagine that we are speaking the same language, but that isn't necessarily the case. And so I think that this is one of the issues that emerges when we talk about, right, this incorporation of anti-racism. One, do we have a shared language? Again, on many of our campuses, again, we've all been tapped to think about these questions, DEI, and yet, do we have a shared understanding of what that means to us? One of the things that we stress in the collection is, and that I stress in the pieces that I've written about, again, being in the humanities, about being in the discipline of English, is this connection to struggles for liberation. So I mentioned FBI's, the incredible book, but Mary Helen Washington also has an extraordinary text, The Other Blacklist, that asks a similar question. Why is it that the Norton Anthology of African American Literature sort of jumps from the Harlem Renaissance to the sort of civil rights era and leaves out, right, that period of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and the kind of leftist organizing, right, that was so central, of course, to the canon, to liberation struggles. So again, it's the Norton, but it slides into an emphasis on modernism, right? And so there's ways that, again, in our discipline specifically, that the move to thinking about a genre and these kinds of terms, again, does that work of sanitizing, of erasing the connection between Black creativity, a Black radical imagination, and movements for liberation that have always accompanied, right, this creative voice that we tend to hold on to as, right, what it is that is the study of Black literature. So again, this question of shared language, and again, how do we develop that shared language through, again, meetings like this, through gathering, through these efforts to build, again, these communities of consciousness. So I'll let Alison take over from there.
Yeah, so I also wanted to comment on this shared language. And so, we've talked in the Anti-Racism Inc. working group about how anti-racism as a term is sort of always already incorporated. It tends to interpolate liberals because, as I mentioned earlier, the position, the sort of reactionary posture is a limited one. And so we've always looked to, the Black radical tradition. Of course, there are other revolutionary epistemologies because it's constantly inventing itself as process. And so, you know, when the language is stolen from us, we have to invent new language. And this is where the poetic imagination comes in. But in terms of the university as a site of struggle and the way the terms have been thefted from us, and so we have to constantly reinvent, you know, one way this plays out is through the rhetoric around free speech. So this is the term, of course, that's been co-opted, was originally championed by Stokely Carmichael, you know, trying to protect radical dissent, you know, at UC Berkeley. And then now we see this total incorporation of free speech to mean while radical voices are getting, you know, canceled on Zoom, we see that free speech is now protected, but what free speech has come to signify is essentially hate speech and not recognizing the difference between the two. So that in the name of, you know, oh gosh, what's that? Diversity of thought, put that in big scare quotes, we are supposed to take tea with Nazis, because this is actually civil discourse in the academy these days, so that terms like free speech now protect hate speech on college campuses, so that, you know, the university actually invests in bringing, you know, speakers to campuses such as, you know, Richard Spencer, but because we can listen to him, because after all, he advocates for peaceful genocide, right? So, you know, it's a sort of Nazis and business casual that now have the, you know, right to the terms that were originally, you know, used to advocate for radical dissent.
I wonder if I can ask a question. First, let me just say quickly to students in HoHum 105, you're welcome to post a question in the Q&A box if you like. We've done a lot of reading with Dr. Blake together, and you're welcome to take advantage of this opportunity. I wonder if I can ask a question. In class on Monday, we watched the video, All Right, Kendrick Lamar's great video, and, you know, talked about how that video kind of puts together these kind of images of Black joy, Black struggle, imagery, kind of dissonant sounds with harmonic sounds, all of these contradictions, as you refer to them, in a single space, that then gets used and appropriated in different ways by movements, by companies, etc. One of the students commented that the kind of use of the handheld camera in that video, in her reading, kind of draws the participant in and sort of invites the viewer to be part of that scene. And in so doing, to kind of connect with some of the, I think you used the phrase, Dr. Blake, intergenerational trauma and intergenerational, I think struggle might be the word you use. I wonder if you could just say about how a video like that is part of the dynamics that you're talking about today, particularly around incorporation.
Those are sharp students doing excellent reading of culture and different forms of cultural expression. Yeah, you know, I've been working on a new project, and like so many of us, thinking about the particular cultural intervention that hip hop has been right across the globe. I think that piece actually begins with James Baldwin, right? Or a quote from James Baldwin, who says, you know, that one of the only places where the history of Black America has been told is in the music. And part of the reason he argues that that is the place where this expression is possible is because a sort of protective covering actually keeps, in his words, sort of white America or the dominant group from really hearing or listening or being able to perceive, again, what's being expressed through the music. So again, you know, the other person who comes to mind for me on this is Amiri Baraka, at that time Leroy Jones, and the book Blues People, where again, as he's looking at the sort of transformation of music from gospel through the blues and different forms of jazz, what he's always attentive to is the way that it shifts. And like Baldwin, it is precisely because of the way that the music gets incorporated. Nate Mackey, who's again referenced in that piece, talks about this same, right? This shift from verb to noun, or the ways that, again, these efforts at trying to move the crowd, as they might say in hip hop, or move thinking, right? The kind of possibilities of transformation, when they get incorporated, also become nouned, or a nounization, as he describes it, so that it becomes fixed. So there is this real emphasis on unfixing, right? Destabilization, disjuncture, again, all of these terms that we often use that's so central to Black music making as a process. What's so striking about this, and this is what brings me back to, again, your question and this new research, you think about something like hip hop, right? Part of the technology, the dynamics, is this process of sampling, right? So you're taking something previous and then making it into something new. So despite the fact that sampling is a part, oh, my internet, is a part of music making, there is also at the same time this impossibility of trying to do what someone else did before, right? This is just, doesn't happen. So it's this kind of complex relationship, again, thinking intergenerationally, that is very much on a connection to the past, even as it's forcing us to move in another direction. And I think that this is some of the amazing tension that's all over Kendrick Lamar, certainly not the only one, but a video like that it's black and white, right? At the same time as it's engaging new technology, right? That it's dealing with police brutality, which again, has been one of these forever questions as we think about this conflict with the state itself, a forever question that again is made anew. You know, in that moment, your students might think about Luke Cage, right? What is his superhero ability? Is that he can't be shot, right? So there are all these extraordinary ways that we see in this realm of expressivity, right, of Black culture, a way that they're always having to engage with what has been the sort of forever struggle, even as with every iteration, there is this movement forward. So I think this is, it gives me goosebumps. Again, is some of the power and why it's been so powerful, even as it's forcing all of us to engage the imagination and to imagine something new.
Can I just say quickly, at the end of that video, as you know, there's a scene where the police officer fires at Lamar, not with his gun, but actually with his fingers. And it's a powerful statement, I think, about the imagination and how deadly it can be.
Can I just add a tiny, I know that question was not for me, but just I was thinking of Angela Davis's Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, and how she writes about how, you know, blues artists, she write, if I can quote, it's something about a camouflage dream of a new social order. And so thinking about what escapes or defies, you know, state incorporation and recognition, and, you know, how artists imagine otherwise, and how that is in defiance of precisely the mechanisms that seek to incorporate it.
Thank you. There are a cluster of questions that are coming in that circle back to some of Professor Blake's original comments. And I think, and you just brought this up again, the structure of the meeting. The idea that, and you use, your language is very evocative, a gathering, a bringing together. And the goal is to form, as you say, communities of consciousness. And, you know, one of the things that really struck me, and I think a number of the comments, the people commenting, is that the bringing together is to bring expertise together, and a recognition of what expertise can be. And this is for, you know, it has a pedagogical goal and it has a social justice kind of action goal. And so there are a number of questions of how, I think there's a desire to hear more about, I'm using my hands, right, of what this gathering, of what forming these communities and these bonds. You know, there's at times when, I mean, these are difficult, hard things, and the sparks can fly and people can retrench. So, and in a sense, someone else's discomfort is not the other person's responsibility. So it's not saying that, but what are your thoughts about the mechanisms of these gatherings and the formings of the communities, and a kind of a template of kind of how to do this work?
Yeah, I love this question because it raises so much for us. This is not meant to be a shameless plug, but the book that I wrote, Black Love, Black Hate, is really focused on this, right? Thinking about intimate antagonisms, that again, we presume that when we gather, we understand who the enemy is and that we're all aligned against that enemy. And yet, again, so much of what we see in these expressive spaces is that that's not automatically clear. I think that what is a part of the struggle here is that, you know, for us, we don't really have good language about conflict. How do we, right, articulate conflict, dissension, and use it in a way that is productive in terms of the possibilities for growth and transformation? So again, you know, the presumption that we might gather and all automatically presume that we're aligned, right? We've argued for so many years, right, that we're not a monolith. Black people are not a monolith, right? The left is not a monolith. Women are not a monolith. So again, there are ways that tension, again, while it doesn't still, I think, have good language for us, is a part of the work that is about what it means for us to come together. In the book, I talk about this experience I had as an undergraduate at UCLA. It was a town hall for Black students called Dissed by Your Own Kind. So it was really meant to be a kind of town hall where Black students could gather to talk about the kinds of conflicts that we had between each other. And as you can imagine, it really was that. You don't say hi when I pass by. I'm queer and I don't want to be harassed by the men. You're an athlete and you got in on you know, this kind of funding that we don't. So again, just a number of kind of conflicts that needed airing in order for us to try to get to a greater understanding about, again, what is community in that context. And I should say, not giving away all of my personal details, but this was in the context of the brutal beating of Rodney King and the uprising in Los Angeles. So we were living in a moment of extraordinary conflict and needing, as a part of our organizing practice, to actually deal with the conflicts that we were seeing between us. I think that, again, people have mentioned some different authors. Again, I think Audre Lorde is fantastic here in this regard. The way that she talks about difference, again, challenging the presumption that difference has to be a basis for how we, again, create hierarchies and determine value, and really pushing back on that understanding. I think that Ruth Wilson Gilmore has a phenomenal chapter in Golden Gulag on the Mothers ROC. Again, a group of women, mothers, again, trying to figure out what were their points of connection to create a basis to fight against what they were seeing happening in their communities, again, with their loved ones being disappeared into the prison system. So again, my encouragement here is, again, do we find a basis for our gathering? And sometimes the basis of it, as Dissed by Your Own Kind, was that, you know, we would like to have community together, and yet we find that we are really at odds with each other. So again, some of the literature, and I think, again, in expressive culture, we do find, as well as these examples from organizing practices, we do find these models for how people were really trying to address a problem. And then from that, to think about, right, what is the basis then that we have for recognizing each other? And sometimes that means creating new terms for recognition, right? What are the terms upon which we are now establishing a basis to see each other, even as we're working through these sort of intimate antagonisms?
Alison, did you want to comment?
I'll just add one of my favorite quotations from, I keep just quoting people, but Audre Lorde from The Edge of Each Other's Battles. She says, "We do not have to be each other to see our earth is dying." And I know that Felice has quoted that in many a lecture as well. But, you know, abolitionists, you know, we're often sort of critiqued as pie in the sky dreamers, but in fact, we're deeply invested in, you know, finding alternative ways of redressing harm. And so a kind of radical love praxis, you know, it doesn't ignore the individual wounds, but it heals them in the service of, you know, cultivating collective relationships that seek to, you know, end oppression, not reproduce it.
Wonderful, thank you. We have time for one more kind of round, and Professor Blake, the language, the observation you made, we don't have good language for conflict. I think is visible. Flip on the news today, or any kind of website, that it becomes there is this kind of acceleration, and it becomes, even amongst savvy critical thinkers, the categories of opposition, of blunt opposition, are so alluring, and so easy, and so comfortable and familiar. And so this gets to another cluster, which folks are asking about: the language of rioting, the language where the focus, I'm using lots of scare quotes here, but the focus is on property, not people. The focus is on destruction. You hear it in the presidential campaign all the time on both sides. And how can you help us? How can we move out of that? What are strategies to, in a sense, to neutralize and turn this, the idea that dissent is destructive? I mean, it kind of, for my opinion, it's good destruction, right? But that dissent is that it is not a civic action. And that it is rioting, and that it's kind of profiteering.
Yeah, that's right.
This one gets me heated.
Yeah, yeah. You know, it's a challenging question. I mean, it really is. I think, you know, as we opened up thinking about the pandemic, of course, there's been the language also of, you know, getting back to normal. When can we see each other again? You know, this kind of anxiety that shows up when we find ourselves in crisis. I think, again, we've been mentioning Ruth Wilson Gilmore a lot, and for good reason. She has another great piece on globalization, where she again thinks about crisis as neutral, right? As a neutral term. It doesn't necessarily mean good or bad, but it is certainly an indication that whatever we've been doing isn't working, right? And that there needs to be a shift or a change. And whatever that change is going to be isn't inevitable, right? There is no inevitable outcome of our current crises. But it is also meaning that there is an opening for us to think about, right? The what next. It's interesting that this question emerges again. I've been thinking about this in relation to this new research. But I do find that we struggle to make propositions, which sort of brings us to a nice way of concluding this talk today. I think sometimes our real struggle to propose, right, a vision for the future is what keeps us falling back onto the kind of terms and categories. We might even hear ourselves saying it, right? I see the protests, I see fires, I see destruction of property, and can't we go back to, right, that building not on fire, things seemingly okay, or sort of the status quo. So in my mind, it is not to say that we're just failed, right? But that out of this, right, it does require some courage, some bravery. And again, Audre Lorde, in that same documentary, The Edge of Each Other's Battles, says herself, you know, I'm a coward who's learned how to be brave. But I think that some of that bravery is around our ability to make a proposition, right? To propose a new vision, to make a demand, to argue for something, to say this is what we want. You know, we're all looking at the build up to this election, and certainly many of us have been frustrated by candidates' inability to make a proposal, right? In the future, this is what it would look like. This is what we'd like to see happen. And I think that this is one of the things that we're all in this moment really having to develop a muscle to learn how to do. Again, knowing that propositions will sometimes be met by conflict. Again, knowing that transformation doesn't just happen seamlessly. Of course, it comes with tension and with pushback. This is a part of the way that we do change and that we grow. So again, my best sort of suggestion would be that, what are we proposing, right? We don't like to see something on fire. What are we proposing, right? Emerges. What is our vision for the future? What would a new space look like? Who's included in that vision? Have we developed new terms and new bases for how we're imagining our relationships, right, out of this? So, you know, as gently as I can, I think this is what I would encourage people to be looking for when we fall back onto the language of catastrophe, right? What is our proposition? What's our vision? What do we want?
And I think that is a really powerful way to conclude, but not. It's conclude, but not. I really want to thank Professors Reed and Blake and for joining us, for making this conversation and the exigency of all of this so visible, and a moment of reflection as then we continue the work in the difficult ways that we do. Thank you again. My thanks to Liam and Danielle, Karen, as always, and Randy, and all of the Honors Humanities students who are here today. You guys, you are the space of hope. All right. Thank you very much. All right.